welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that presentation. There was a lot of good information and insight that I hope will be helpful to you in the days to come. But our next presentation will be provided by our own director, Bishop Roland Hairston and Dr. Marion Wright. That's Bishop Dr. Roland Hairston and Dr. Marion Wright, who will be sharing more clinical information about how we are impacted in this time in history. So if you're wondering why you're exhausted, why you're tired, why you might be experiencing some depressed mood and some anxiety, stay tuned. You're about to get some information. After this presentation, we'll be back again to share a little bit more about what's happening next.
Good morning and praise the Lord to the household of faith. Good morning here on the West Coast and good afternoon to all of our brothers and sisters that are on the line throughout the country and for that matter around the world. We're delighted, Dr. Wright and I are delighted to be able to come to you this morning and this afternoon and talk a little bit about the fatigue epidemic. If you are tired, it's for good reason. If you're running on empty, it's for good reason. And we thank God for the opportunity that Dr. Wright and I have to share with you about this very important topic. We have been through a tremendous previous 10 months of 2020. Our illustrious presider, Bishop Theodore Brooks, shared with me the desire in his heart and mind to come to the household of faith, to the PsyD with this health conference. And we hope that there will be more to come in the future. But he and I shared with him the same sentiment as did my committee, that there is a tremendous need. We're getting the feedback from all across the country at the constituent level of the need that many across the country in the PsyD for this kind of information to come to them. Privileged to be able to share with you. So as we begin, I'm going to throw it to Dr. Wright and just ask him if he'll give us an intro so that we'll become some more familiar with him. Dr. Wright, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from and what you do.
Thank you very much, Bishop Hairston. I'm delighted to be here and to be a part of this great event and something that I believe is very much needed in the body of Christ today. I am Dr. Marion Wright, Jr. Many of you may know my father very well, Bishop Dr. Marion Wright, Sr. I am his eldest son and namesake. But again, I'm delighted to be here. As far as what enables me to be a part of this panel, I work in mental health. I am a psychiatrist. My undergraduate training was at Duke University. I was fortunate to be able to attend an undergraduate university in my hometown at that time. I proceeded from there and went to medical school at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So that was a mere 10 miles down the street from home. I finished the final 4 years of my training at East Carolina University, the Brody School of Medicine in the metropolis of Greenville, North Carolina. I am now working in the community health setting. A very rural area of our state is in the eastern part of North Carolina. I work for the Kinston Community Behavioral Health Center, which is actually part of a community model center. We are, of course, I do the behavioral health portion, but our clinic also offers primary care services, pediatrics, family care, even dentistry. And I'm with our behavioral health division of that particular clinic. As I mentioned last night, I also have worked previously in private practice and also in the student health or college health setting. I worked part-time for the East Carolina University Student Health Services for about 4 or 5 years. But I am delighted to be here. I'm going to jump right in to continue some of the discussion, or at least a brief part of the discussion that I mentioned on night. The word stigma came up in our conversation, and I just wanted to talk very briefly about a book that God enabled me to author. The title of the book is called The Suppression of Depression. It also has a subtitle, which is Addressing the Stigma of Depression Among Christians. So there it is, that word stigma was built into the subtitle of my book. Now, I understand today the bulk of what we're going to be talking about is anxiety. However, we understand there's a lot of comorbidity with depression as well. The part that I want to speak on briefly before I turn it back over to Bishop Hairston, again, focusing on the word stigma, even though this is just a brief how the book looks, even though, again, the content of this particular book is geared mainly towards depression, I believe that the word stigma applies to mental health in general, and also including anxiety disorder. To talk a little bit about the inspiration behind the book.
Okay.
Yes, it in the introduction to the book, on the very first page, I make statements about what led me to or inspired me to write this book. And it basically was based on the observation of a pattern of behaviors that I saw among patients who reported to be Christians. At that time, I was very new in private practice, and probably just about a couple of years in at that. And I began to notice a pattern of behavior, again, to use that terminology, among patients who reported to be Christians. I'm just going to read a brief excerpt. It won't take very long. A brief excerpt, kind of explaining, again, the inspiration behind the book. Again, in the introduction to the book, this is on the very first page. And part where I'll pick up, it says, again, referring to patients of the Christian faith, that feelings of guilt and embarrassment were common. Many people felt guilty as if having depression was due to some fault or personal flaw. Others felt ashamed and did not want fellow church members or friends to know they were seeing a mental health professional. Some would go so far as to park their vehicles in inconspicuous areas to avoid being seen entering or leaving my office building. Observing all of these patterns over an extended period of time made me ponder what it was about patients of faith that caused them to think, feel, and behave in such ways. Just to give a few brief examples, and then I'll turn it back over to Bishop Hairston. When I talked about people parking their vehicles in inconspicuous areas, I had patients who would literally park their cars in the back parking lot of my office building. The building where my office was located at that time was on a very well-traveled street, and it was very close to the street. Someone could easily drive by the office, throw a rock out their window if they wanted to, and hit my office window. So as my wife would say, our office was on Front Street. And so I noticed that some patients, instead of parking in the front of the building where we designated for patient parking, they would actually park in the back that was supposed to be used for employee parking. I even had some patients who parked at a gas station that was located not far from my office and would actually walk from the gas station to the office. Again, just so they wouldn't be seen entering into a psychiatric office. Another quick example I'll share. I remember a lady, and again, these are people who reportedly were Christians or had faith of that kind. I remember one lady, she comes in for her initial session, and she's sitting there, she's clutching her purse, and repeatedly throughout the session, she's looking at the door. So I'm thinking, wow, is she paranoid? Does she have some type of psychotic disorder? As it turned out, she was depressed. But so finally I asked her, I said, is there something that's making you anxious? You know, is there something you're afraid of? And she said, well, to be honest, you know, I almost have this fear that at any time my pastor or somebody from my church is going to walk through that door. And I was like, well, unless they followed you here, no one even has to know that you're here. And she clutched her purse very close to her, because almost as if she had to leave at any moment, if she felt, hey, I don't want to do this, I'm having second thoughts about even being here, then, you know, that was something that I found interesting. So again, that was just an introduction of some examples of behaviors that I had observed from people that led me to write this book. Again, this stigma is applicable to mental health in general, and so I'm delighted to be a part of this type of panel and discussion. So Bishop Hairston, I'll give it back to you, and you know, we're delighted to hear what you would have to add to this.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. And again, you're already into the thick of it, and that's a good thing. Our topic, as has been publicized, is the fatigue epidemic. And we want to be able to speak to the questions of anxiety and depression, and as well as suicidality. And we'll get into more of that as we move along. But Dr. Wright, thank you for that introduction of both yourself and your book, The Suppression of Depression, a very apt title. God bless you, and I pray that it will be a tremendous blessing to our constituents all across the country and a tremendous resource. That said, again, we want to focus, and let me encourage anyone and everyone who you see our various forms of giving across the bottom, the tagline across the bottom, and let me encourage you to give, those of you that are able to, and be a real blessing to the committee. Again, this is brought to you by the Committee on Health, Education, and Wellness, and I serve as the director for the committee. We've been in existence for a couple of years now, and with the support of the presider and the ABC, this conference is being brought to you. I think many of you were on the call yesterday. We had the panel discussion yesterday. Absolutely tremendous impact, I think, that it had all across the country. But we encourage you to continue to submit your questions and comments and so on. We have both posted our email addresses so that if there are questions or concerns afterwards, that you can always follow up with us via our email. That said, let's talk, Dr. Wright, a little bit about this notion of anxiety and depression. What I have noticed is a tremendous epidemic, not just of fatigue as it relates to the pandemic, that has been obviously tremendously impactful on us as a country, as a people, both in the church and out. And so it's been a concern for me as I have received patients. And by the way, I do have a small clinic. I work out of a nonprofit organization in Seattle on a part-time basis. As many of you know, I serve on the executive board as a diocesan bishop. My diocese is the Pacific Northwest District Council. We here in the Northwest have a 5-state region that we are the diocesan for. As well, I pastor the Grace Apostolic Temple. So needless to say, my hands are full. and we're endeavoring to serve the people of God in any and every capacity that God has given us gifts to serve in. So when I understand all that is happening in terms of the pandemic, if you're experiencing any kind of depression or anxiety as a result, that it's perhaps well deserved. We all are going through something at some level. Anxiety, though, is the number one diagnosed illness. Everyone, I think, feels anxious now and then. It's a normal emotion. For example, you may feel nervous when faced with a problem at work or at home or whatever may be going on in your life. But anxiety disorders are really very different. They are a group of mental illness and distress that cause and can keep you from carrying on in your normal life or daily activities. For people who have worry and fear that is constant, that is overwhelming, and can be disabling, that's the kind of anxiety that we really want to deal with. And we'll get to some treatment strategies, most that are available to you, and we'll talk about that in some detail. We don't necessarily know as researchers exactly what brings on anxiety disorders. Like other forms of mental illness, they stem from a combination of things. For example, changes in your brain and environmental stress, even your genes. The disorder can run in families and could be linked to faulty circuits in the brain that control fear and other emotions. I'll talk in a moment about burnout versus stress or anxiety, but I also want to bring in the notion of suicidality, because that also becomes very important. And the target population, as we talk about this today, is both leaders and constituents. We don't want to leave out the constituents because all of us are going through something right about now. I know the vaccine is out and it's available. I haven't gotten mine yet, but it is available, and we are scheduled to get it and hope to do that very soon. But Dr. Wright, talk a little bit about, from your perspective as a psychiatrist, and not just a psychiatrist, but saved and sanctified psychiatrist, right? Talk a little bit about the maybe origins of, as I kind of briefly alluded to, but anxiety and depression and suicidality.
Thank you, Bishop. You gave a very great introduction into that. Interestingly, I had done a Bible study session with my church. Of course, it was done virtually, where I talked a little bit about the science or biology behind anxiety in general. Of course, we know that for something to be considered a disorder, it has to affect, various areas of a person's life. But I talked very briefly about the amygdala, which are tiny structures in the brain, and I promise you I won't get too much into this, but it is very important for people to understand. And I made this in the Bible study lesson that I taught, that God created us with these structures in our brain. And these tiny structures in the brain essentially are designed to signal the brain, which eventually signals the rest of the body, that something has happened, something that could produce fear or could be potentially dangerous in our environment has happened. So in a very basic sense, I define anxiety to some of my patients as, just the internal responses that, tell the rest of the body, hey, there's something that needs to be done. Of course, again, for that's something naturally that we experience even on a daily basis. It's just that in people that have anxiety disorders, for whatever reason, some of these signals in the brain maybe not really regulated. Again, without getting into too much science, I think now with information that's available on the internet, a lot of people are familiar with the term neurotransmitters and serotonin, dopamine, and things of that nature that are released that work as signaling mechanisms in the brain. So there is a lot of thought that at least a part of what may generate or cause anxiety disorders in some people is biologically determined. And, you know, Bishop Hairston also mentioned about genetics. We have to factor that in. There are things about people's environment. A lot of times I'll talk to my patients and ask about their family history. And so there are times even if anxiety disorders, depression, and things of that nature are not necessarily inherent at birth, there are things that people learn about how to respond to stress that occurs in their household. I've seen teenagers as patients or young people that are very anxious, and I'm thinking, wow, you know, this is a very anxious person. And then I meet their parents,
Right.
and find out that, wow, I thought they were anxious until I saw the mom. and so that just brings out the whole point that sometimes, you know, what we're exposed to in our environment almost, you know, can come upon us as well, because, you know, our parents and other people in our household may model the way that we learn to respond to stress and anxiety. Bishop.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I saw one question that has been raised about the fear that many feel in coming to see a psychiatrist or psychologist too, for that matter. But they've never, in all likelihood, not seen a black face across the desk, and so there's this intimidation, maybe, or fear factor. But sadly, you know, in our church history, we've never been encouraged by pastors and so on to really make it a point to add mental health to our spiritual health. And I think both of them are necessary and essential. And there's a particular alignment that I talk about from time to time. Body, soul, and spirit has to be totally aligned. And that soulish nature, where many of these struggles we have kind of emanates from, is, you know, what we really need to work through some of these issues. And again, we'll get to some strategies for relief momentarily. But you're talking about stress and anxiety and depression as kind of like a total kind of ball of things that emotionally we experience from time to time. Let me point out a couple of maybe distinguishing characteristics between what may be termed burnout. I mean, you've been engaged and so on with your work, your job, whatever, all of the things going on at home, and you can get really burnt out, right? That's not quite the same as the effects of stress in terms of anxiety. Burnout is a defense mechanism that's characterized by disengagement. Stress or anxiety, on the other hand, is characterized by over-engagement. Burnout, the emotions become blunted. With stress and anxiety, the emotions become overactive. Let me point out a couple of other distinguishing characteristics too, because burnout, the emotional damage is primary. In stress, the physical damage is primary. In terms of, with anxiety comes the release of cortisol into our bloodstream, into our system, and it debilitates many of our organs, and sometimes prematurely because of the influx of that cortisol within our system. The exhaustion of burnout affects motivation and drive. The exhaustion of stress affects physical energy. And sometimes we feel unmotivated and not really want to do the things that we normally do. Burnout can best be understood as a loss of ideals and hope. Stress can be best understood as a loss of fuel or energy. Burnout produces a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. Stress produces a sense of urgency and hyperactivity. Just a couple of more thoughts. Burnout produces demoralization. Anxiety and stress produces disintegration. Burnout produces paranoia, depersonalization, and detachment. Stress produces something a little bit heavier, like panic, phobia, and as we've been saying, anxiety and depression. I think there's a lot, amen, that can be said about these kinds of experiences that we have. And again, we'll get to some strategies momentarily. But Dr. Wright, I'm really concerned. You kind of started us with the idea that many Christians, quote unquote Christians, have difficulty owning their need for mental and emotional health. And I think that that's really important for us to recognize that there is a struggle in the pew with individuals who are experience these emotional, mental kinds of disorders and so on, and don't really know what to do about it. Oftentimes, there's no real encouragement from the pulpit because it's hard to make distinctions over the pulpit about what a person may be experiencing. There's a certain level of understanding about mental and emotional health that maybe is common, and we often talk about it over the kitchen table, or maybe we're having a family engagement or whatever, and issues of mental health come up. And sometimes if we're not careful, that whole issue of stigmatization enters the scene, enters the picture. And it's hard then to get someone to indeed be encouraged to go and see someone professional about their real experiences that they're having. I think it's really important. How would you encourage, Dr. Wright, how would you encourage, I know your father's a pastor, obviously, Bishop Marion Wright Sr., and you teach Bible class and so on. So what do you say to the saints, to the congregation, when it comes to what they're going through mentally and emotionally as you're teaching Bible class and so on, and all the while encourage them to get this added support by seeing a mental health professional?
That's a very good question, Bishop. One of the things that I try to do in encouraging people to seek help is to get them to see their health as a whole. Now, granted, we are taught to kind of talk about mind, body, and soul, and so a lot of times we think of these as distinct entities, which they are. But one of the things I do to try to encourage people to seek help is to not get into the dichotomy of, well, this is my medical or physical health, and this is my mental health. And I think if people learn to think of their health or their being as a whole, right, I think it would be easier for them to seek help, even if it's for something that regarding their mentality and their emotions. Right. Some of the content I cover in the book talks about this dichotomy of, hey, this is physical, this is mental. I think as a whole, the church has made more strides as far as getting people to seek help for medical or physical health conditions. But I think we still lag greatly behind as far as encouraging people to seek help for mental health conditions. But right. I use that and I try to tell people, hey, I'm on medication for my blood pressure. I see that it's important for me to maintain a proper proper blood pressure, you know, and to maintain my overall health. I became much more concerned about maintaining good health once I got married and started a family. You know, so I thought of it as, hey, whatever I need to do to maintain my health, to be here for my wife, to be a father for my children, I need to do it. And so, yes, I take medicine for blood pressure. Matter of fact, I take 2 different ones. And the other thing that I will say, another thing I try to do to encourage people to seek help, even if it's for a mental health condition, is I go beyond even, you know, medical things. What I mean there is that whether or not we realize it, we seek help from various sources on a regular basis. If someone needs legal help, they go to a lawyer. if they need, you know, that people in the church, some of them have no problems trusting someone who's has an expertise in accounting or financing. You know, they'll go to those people. Hey, tell me how to invest my money, how to make more money. But it's interesting to me that when it comes to matters of people's health, particularly their mental health, all of a sudden, no, that's I'm not doing that. You know, I just need to pray more and seek the face of God. When you know, it's almost hypocritical in a sense to think that we can trust, you know, people who are experts in these other areas and go to them for help. But when it comes to something that affects our overall health and well-being, that we're afraid to do so. So that's one of the ways I encourage people to seek help, even though they're Christians and have faith.
Thank you for that. I think that's really important. I know that when I was in school, I learned about the medical model, biopsychosocial, right, in terms of the holistic approach to the whole body, the whole man, right, woman. But when I realized the medical model, I understood from my spiritual background that spirituality is an integral part of that as well. So my model is bio, psycho, social, spiritual, right? So there's an integration of our total being. And again, I think the scripture upholds that position because it teaches us about body, soul, spirit, and that embraces in the entirety of who we are and what we represent. So, and I know this is a little bit an aside, but I wanted to also bring into maybe the discussion some things about personality disorder. Now, as a psychiatrist, I know you deal with personality disorders, the DSM-5 and all of that. And, you know, without getting into all of the weeds about, you know, diagnoses and all of those things, do you see a greater prevalence? And you know, obviously we're talking about depression and anxiety and burnout and those things, but I think personality disorders play into that as well. For example, if we're struggling with ADHD, and I know that's not a personality disorder, but it is the kind of disorder that we struggle with and can cause us to kind of to swing that mood thing between highs and lows, between mania and depression. And in a church setting, a particular congregant may struggle in this area. And more importantly, their need for support in terms of their psyche or in terms of their mental health really becomes important. Do you see much in the way of personality disorder playing out, whether in leaders or whether or not in congregations?
Yes, very good point. I'll have to step carefully here with my you know, father being a pastor, and yourself, and for those who may be watching and listening. And I also have to try to avoid talking about governmental leadership or former leadership. I won't get too much into that. But, you know, there's I'll say very briefly, to be a leader, to a certain extent, I think it takes a certain level of confidence, which I think is important. I think it'd be hard for people to follow a leader who didn't have any confidence in making decisions, making tough decisions, and basically, leading. However, many of us, I think, are familiar with the term or narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, now this doesn't apply to my father, please. But it's interesting that some leaders, could certainly fall in that category. Where just in layman's terms, it's all about them. They can be very charming people, and they can somehow influence other people to buy into their ideals and everything. But in the end, it's all to serve them. Now, if there's something that damages their ego, to use that terminology, then these people can, as they say, flip the script on you. They can become mean people and do things that are seem to be unbecoming of leadership.
Right.
But yes, to answer that, I think the personality disorders are a concern as well, and not just to talk about that particular one, but that is something actually that we see. And one last thing I'll say on that, thinking about personality disorders among Christians or people in the church, it's from a treatment standpoint, clinically or professionally, we're kind of taught that the personality disorders may not necessarily be curable. They're treatable. I think in large sense, but that takes a long process of time. So yes, I would say to the saints, even if there are issues dealing with personality disorders, they can seem very subtle and may not be things that are readily noticeable by leaders, in terms of people in their congregation. But that's something as well that I try to encourage people to seek help with.
To be sure. And again, I think the major area that going forward, and by the way, Doc, we're getting a lot of questions about this whole area of personality disorder and anxiety and so on. And I would encourage you to keep the questions flowing, even if we don't get to some specific things on the presentation. We'll certainly be able to follow up afterwards. But among leaders and as well among constituents, we do have this whole area that really will need some support going forward. The pandemic was enough, right? That almost everybody needs to see somebody about something, at a professional level. We're going to need some counseling going forward, even with the vaccine, because as we have heard, that the vaccine is going to help, but it's not going to necessarily eliminate the virus, right? So I think we're in a good place in the church because we are opening up dialogue. We're giving voice to many who have not had a voice in the past, in terms of recognizing that there are experiences that we have that are not always understood, and the scripture doesn't necessarily give us all of the answers in this regard. So it really is important that we open up the conversation and have these kinds of discussions really all across the country going forward. I think in every diocese, every diocesan bishop should be recognizing the importance and need for mental health dialogue within their diocese. I know we're doing that in my diocese, and I encourage pastors that are in my diocese to really look at the whole issue of mental health. Because when they are struggling, saints are struggling, pastors should be able to offer them something besides, take a prayer pill or whatever that's like, or, be able to give them some real professional support. And I don't think it detracts or takes anything away from them. So, Doc, let's talk a little bit now about some strategies. There are several things that I have in mind that I want to share, and then we'll throw it to you and let you talk about your perspective about strategy. So there may be 4 or 5 points, and I'll only emphasize 2, but I also have in mind that we can do a couple of things that are really important. I alluded to them yesterday on the panel. Number 1, in terms of relief when it comes to fatigue and the fact that we are overwhelmed, it seems, with so much now, particularly as leaders, the pressure we feel, the need to be there and available for our congregation and so on, as well as those that are in the pew that are really struggling. What comes to my mind is 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 16. And it simply says, who is sufficient for these things? So I'm often tempted to have it all together in a way that only God does or can. That is, as a leader, needing to have my whole thing in place and in order. If you can imagine the pressure of having to preach every single Sunday of the year, 52 Sundays of the year, right? Except, of course, when you have invite someone to come in. A lot of pressure. Bible class, a lot of pressure. Dealing with problems in the congregation, a lot of pressure. Sometimes that Jehovah syndrome goes into play, and we think we have to be all things to all people. But I need to freshly embrace my own limitations, my inadequacies, as it relates to the things that I need to focus on and not focus on other things. And I mentioned yesterday, and I'll repeat again, I cannot be omnipresent as a pastor who tries to be everywhere and be there for everyone. Instead, what I understand now is that God has called me to be faithful to what is in front of me. The reason that I've been successful over the years, both as a pastor and a psychologist working with people's issues, is that I don't bring the problems home, right? I deal with what is in front of me when I'm seeing a patient or a client, and it stays there. And in the church, I deal with the questions of the day, the questions of the week, and I don't get too far out and certainly don't lag too far behind. So God called me to deal with what is in front of me, and he will not put on me any more than I'm able to bear. I can't call everyone. I can't read every blog post. I can't listen to every newscast, or certainly not accept every invitation, although I enjoy getting invitations, right? I enjoy seeing patients in my clinic, but overload, no. I want to be very careful about my limitations. I'm limited, but my God is not. And that's okay. I cannot be an omnipresent, or rather omnipotent pastor who tries to fix everything and everyone, right? I've got to learn to rest knowing these are things that I cannot control or fix. I can't even be a perfect husband, right? A perfect father, a perfect pastor or friend. God strengthens me in my shortcomings or my weaknesses or the areas that I cannot get to. And lastly, I cannot be omniscient as a pastor who has all the answers. God has not called me to be politically savvy about everything that's going on politically, even socially, right? And all of the current nuances of the coronavirus and even all of the technological advances that are out there today. My young people can do a better job about that than me, right? So I think it's important, and we need to deal with that. So that's one area, just to embrace our limitations. What would you suggest as a strategy for dealing with some of the fatigue epidemic and all of the issues that sometimes we're overloaded with? What are your thoughts?
Bishop, I couldn't have said it better myself. I do assist my father as the assistant pastor at our church. Of course, he still carries the bulk of the load in terms of leadership, but also preparing messages for the congregation. As I think this is applicable to both leaders and people in the congregation, but especially for leaders. And this may be a foreign concept to some. Two things: proper sleep and vacation. As leaders in any sense, sometimes these seem to be foreign concepts, because just as you mentioned, a lot of times leaders get caught in the trap of thinking they need to be all things to all people at all times, and things that seem so simple as, hey, make sure you get enough sleep, make sure you take breaks and vacations from time to time, can be very difficult, because people may feel guilty if they're not working. Oh, I'm supposed to be doing something, or there's something else that needs my attention, at this time. But I'll make one last brief. We're prepared to wrap up. But it's sleep is very important. As a physician, mental health professional myself, a lot of times I felt bad because I felt that I was being hypocritical. And what I mean by that is, I'm constantly encouraging and telling patients, get enough sleep, get enough rest. And there were times when I wasn't even doing it myself, when it felt that I was struggling to even stay awake, for the entire workday. But there are many things that people can do to ensure that they're getting the proper sleep, proper rest. We don't need to get into details about sleep hygiene and practical things that people can do, even just to set aside adequate time to sleep. But one last thing I'll say about that is, I was having a discussion with someone just a few days ago, that I find sometimes that patients will decline taking sleep medication. Some of them don't even take over-the-counter options that are available to help them sleep. But the irony I find in that is that you find a lot of times that people will ingest all types of substances to try to stay awake, but then when you try to offer them something to to help them sleep, they don't want any parts of it. People will drink inordinate amounts of caffeine, energy drinks, caffeine pills, NoDoz, all these types of things that are available. And to even delve into this, some people will smoke crack, use cocaine, just because they need to try to stay awake. But again, if they focus a lot of times on getting proper sleep, they'll find that they won't need or won't be tempted to use these other things. So I think sleep, again, proper rest and vacations are very important. Bishop?
Thank you. Indeed, I struggle in both those areas, by the way, getting enough sleep for sure, and proper rest and all of that. It's important, I think, also to have a change of pace in terms of a strategy, where we also can check our disciplines, right? I have a discipline every morning where when I wake up, I have equipment in my lower level of my house where I actually have a workout for about 90 minutes every morning, which helps kind of bring me back and get me oriented, both naturally and spiritually. The other thing too is not to compare myself with others, because that gets me into deep trouble when I see my peers doing one thing or the other, seemingly to get ahead of me, and then I have to push to try and overtake them or whatever. But those kinds of comparisons are really inappropriate and unhealthy. Let me also talk a little bit about another issue in some detail. And again, I alluded to it yesterday, and that is to discern your soul, to discern your soul. This is about introspection. This is about understanding the shadow side of who you are. And all of us, I think, have a shadow side. The reality is we all grew up in a family of origin, and sometimes that family of origin did not serve us well. And so we are now young adult, right? And we're struggling in certain areas of our life. And I think the whole idea of discerning one's soul is really important, that is being introspective enough to recognize that flat out, I have issues, whether they are of a personality nature or whatever that may be about. I need to have an understanding better about that and to be able to access some support. Oftentimes, and we talked a little bit about faith, versus the reality of our mental emotional needs. Faithfulness is always about pressing through our difficulties and pressures. As you've often heard in testimonies, people are saying, I'm going through, right? Meaning that they're having a particular challenge in their life. Sometimes in those particular instances, it behooves us just to slow down, take some time, just stop and reorient. Ask the questions. What are we anxious about? Where is the pressure coming from? Who am I afraid of disappointing? What am I running to for comfort? Again, we have to be very careful, but these are, I think, valid questions. Let me repeat them. What am I anxious about? Where is the pressure coming from? Who am I afraid of disappointing? And what am I running to for comfort? Give voice to what's swirling around inside of you, to try to understand why I may raise my voice and there's no real cause, or why I may bark at my wife or even the dog for that matter, and there's no cause. Understanding indeed what is swirling around inside of me is really critical, I think, to our ability to strategize about coming through our particular environment, whatever that's been like. Certainly the Fed has done enough. Certainly the political unrest has done enough. Certainly the social unrest has done enough. What comes to mind is Proverbs 20 and verse 5. The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Flat out, Doc, sometimes we need a trusted friend to expose our fears, anxieties, and expectations to, or even sin that may be crushing us. The Bible teaches us to cast all of our cares upon Him. I see we're just about at the end of our session. So Dr. Wright, however you want to close out, you have a few minutes to do that.
I'll let you end, Bishop, if you want to talk about the giving, but thanks everyone for watching, and please email us questions and continue to keep the questions coming in.
Absolutely. Keep the flow going. This is not over just because the presentation comes to an end. Dialogue will ensue, and we want to be able to realize not just the giving portion, and we encourage you to give, but at the same time, we want you to receive a message, very clear message, that we're here to support you in whatever way that is really needed on your part. So send your emails in, send your questions in. We're monitoring them live, even as you're sending them in. We'll collect them and we'll be able to evaluate how we're doing overall as a conference, because we want to report back to our presiding bishop about the success of our event. God bless you richly is my prayer. And however we can support you in the past, feel free to get in touch with us.